Sunday school here at Cliffview Chapel in Kanab. We're glad you're here today, and if you're watching this morning, we're glad that you're watching online, and if you can join us, join us. If you're watching now, you still have time to turn the volume up, go get ready, and then come on down and join us at 10 o'clock for the worship service. Now, if you're watching from a faraway place, that may not be as easy to do, unless you own your own helicopter or jet. And we have known people to own their own helicopter in our church, right? We are in Esther. So that's at the end of those 12 historical books in the Old Testament. So it's Joshua, Judges, Ruth, and then 1st and 2nd Kings, or Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, and then Esther, Nehemiah, Esther. It was long there. Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther. So we're Esther, interesting lady. So what does this have to do here with Esther? Well, that's the Persian Empire when they were in control. And this little place here, Susa, you'll see down here, is where most of the action takes place. It was kind of like the main place there. So we finished up Nehemiah last week. Just a couple of concluding thoughts on Nehemiah. When you often see a sermon series on a character of the Old Testament that shows some character qualities that would be good in our life, Nehemiah seems to be that guy. He is one of those guys that a lot of series and books have been written about. He's a man of prayer. It records 9 of his prayers in the book of Nehemiah itself. He's known as a man of prayer. He is a man of vision. He even though he had a very comfortable life, he could not rest when he knew that the city of God was in ruins. So he left his comfort and went to do God's work. So he was a man of vision. Nehemiah had success before he did the rebuild, and he noticed how the king was not concerned about the cost of rebuilding, but he wanted to send Nehemiah to get that, allow that to be done. He was willing to work and encourage other people to work alongside him. He talked about how we've got to watch out for each other when we're building this wall. He understood the key to success was the unity of the people, getting the people to have one mind to work and to go forward with God's work. And when it was all said and done, Nehemiah gave the credit to God for what was done. Encouraged the people to do the same thing. Remember, who was it? Was it Obama that says, you didn't build that? Well, he's right, but it wasn't the community that built it. It was God that built it. You know, when people say, y'all did a great job. Well, God is the one that gets all the glory. He chose to use this feeble instrument, vessel, to do his work. And that hopefully keeps us in perspective of how God works. So we're going to look at Esther here. It's an interesting book. Anybody know any interesting facts about Esther? Yes, my wife. Well, then, yeah, the name God, there isn't a direct reference to God in the book. Which was interesting when they were looking at the books that would be in the canon of Scripture, that they would acknowledge this. These are the books that are inspired. There was a little question in people's minds way back yonder about this book being in the Bible, not mentioning the name of God. Even though his name isn't mentioned, his providence is all over the book. His fingerprint, so to speak, is all over the book. For instance, when you look at the Sermon on the Mount in Acts chapter 17 that Paul preached, in the sermon itself, it's never mentioned in the name of Jesus Christ. It mentions God, but not Jesus Christ. Now, it says that when he went to Athens, he preached Jesus in his resurrection. And so some people want to say, well, that sermon really is not a good example of how to do it because it doesn't mention the name of Christ. Well, they already have a frame of reference because of his previous preaching there to him. But then when he does get on into the sermon, he says that God will judge the world by that man, and that God has shown that by resurrection. So certainly there's implying who that was, and so we understand Esther that same way. Even though there's no name mentioned straight out, it has God written all over it. It is really a book about the providence of God, how God is working out ahead of time the things that are needed later. We call that meticulous providence of God. Sometimes people say, I would have been at church, but I was providentially hindered. What does that mean? Well, the providence of God, how those things turned out in that person's life that day because God was working in that, prohibited them from being there. They may be, for instance, in the hospital. That's a good providential hinder. And we know that that's part of the plan. If we're in the hospital, that God would put us there or allow us to go there. So this has the providence of God written all over it. Here's what one person says about it. Interesting quote about this book. The silence about God is quite deliberate in this book, not to make the point that he's not inactive in the human situation, but on the contrary, that he is hidden behind all events. It is the implication of the numerous coincidental occurrences in the book. The story can become, therefore, a powerful statement about the reality of God in a world from which he appears to be absent. People will say, when a catastrophe takes place, what's one of the first things they'll say? Where is or where was God in this? Where was God? Why didn't he stop it? Well, he's so present that he's not obvious to us. He should be, but our vision is that he is a great God. So let's talk a little bit about this book. You're in Esther chapter 1. It's not a real long book. It is not one of the minor prophets because it's not a book written by a prophet. It is a book that is part of the 12 historical books. Remember 5:12, 5:5:12. Maybe that sounds like a broken record, but I hope it's our automatic response to how the Old Testament is laid out. The first 5 is what books? The first 5 is the law, the Pentateuch, books of Moses. The 12 is history, and this is the last of those 12 books. And then it's 5:12, 5:5. So that 5. The next one is the books, so we call them wisdom, or the literature books. That would be Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and then points for that last one, if you remember that last. Song of Solomon, yes. Some people forget about that one. And then you have the the third 5, and that is the major prophets. And that is Isaiah, Jeremiah. And Jeremiah wrote a book, Lamentations. And there's 2 that's very prophetic, Ezekiel and Daniel. And then you get to these ones that we're going to be in this new sermon series in a few weeks. Those are the ones called the minor prophets. And we want to try those? Let's try those. Hosea, Joel, Amos, Obadiah, Jonah, Micah, Nahum, Habakkuk, Zephaniah, Haggai, Zechariah, and finally, the last one in the Old Testament is Malachi. You're saying, I'll never get those. Practice. And we'll be practicing those. And once we go through the series, you'll go, oh, now I understand why there's 12 books and how they all work together and what they're doing. And you have that chart or that card we gave you. If you normally attend Sunday school and you just didn't happen to be there that Sunday, let us know. We'll get you one. And we'll pass more out when we start the series, but it will tell you when they were written and so forth here. So this right here, the Persian Empire, is the setting of this story of Esther. Here's what one person wrote as a summary of why Esther was given to us. The book of Esther is a story about an orphaned Jewish girl thrown into a world of political intrigue and power plays in the Persian court. Although the book does not mention God, his hand is seen throughout the story. Esther becomes the queen and had to make choices that required much courage and faith. The book offers reassurance that even when God seems to be absent from our world or our suffering, he is ever present, interested, and ready to act. The book affirms in narrative form what the Apostle Paul affirms in his letter to the Romans. Romans 8:28, we know all things work together for good and for those that are called according to his purpose. And so, with that in mind, let's kind of look at this book of Esther and see what we can learn from it. The book's kind of laid out in three segments, sections. The first is the introduction. That's chapters 1 and 2. It's the laying open of the story of what's going to happen. The second section is about banquets, plots, and survival. It's about some banquets that Esther has and plots that were made against her uncle and the Jewish people, essentially, and how God brought survival to him and twisted that plot right around to bite the guy who made it, the enemy who made it, right in the proverbial rear end. And then the third, and that's, by the way, is chapters 3 through halfway through chapter 9. The third segment, and the final one, is the time to celebrate this great victory that God has given. And that's where we find the institution of the Jewish feast Purim, which was a very festive feast to celebrate God-giving victory. And that's basically the rest of chapter 9 into chapter 10 there. So chapters 1 and 2, it deals with a king, Ahasuerus, and also a queen named Vashti. You'll see here in verse 11 of chapter 1. And a man named Mordecai, and a young girl named Esther. Esther, and hence the title of the book. This book occurs while some of the Jews are still in exile. Some had left, because remember, the Babylonians took the southern kingdom, Judah, into exile. Now, the northern kingdom, 150 years before, had been taken in exile by who? Let's flip over to our master chart here. No, that's not it right there. That's it right there. All right, we're looking at it right here. So remember, this is the northern kingdom, and they fall, the Samaria, which is the headquarters, the capital of the northern kingdom. They fall to what? They fall to Assyrian captivity. And those are 10 tribes of the 12 that are involved in that. And they never really emerge intact out of that exile. Then a number of years later, roughly 150 years later, the southern kingdom, Judah. This was known as Israel. Southern kingdom is Judah. They go into exile in several waves, Babylonian exile. But going in, the prophets knew how long they would be there. How many? What was 70, right? Remember, that was for abusing. Every 7 years is supposed to be a Sabbath rest for the land, and they abused that for 490 years, and now they're essentially paying for it. So they go to Babylonian captivity. Well, eventually, the Persians and the Medes, they invade Babylon, and they overtake it. And now they're in charge, particularly the Persian element of it. And it's the Persian, Cyrus, the Persian king, that grants Zerubbabel to take the first waves of the exiles back to rebuild, the temple, right? And then you have Ezra later on going back to be the spiritual guide of all that. And then eventually you have Nehemiah going back and helping them get the wall done. But in the process of that, there are still some exiles left in Persia. And this is where the story is, the setting that it takes place. And in this, you're going to see that it happens while these people in Persia are still in exile. This is God's people who had for decades been in a hostile environment, far away from the land they had been promised by God, without a temple to worship God in. They had spent many years learning to be God's people with God dwelling in their midst. Now they needed to learn how to be God's people away from the land, without a temple, surrounded by people with a different system of beliefs. And that was their test, their learning. And so this map shows us some of this. You obviously, let me flip back over there. You obviously can see on this, Babylonian. This would have been where the Assyrian Empire had been, right here. Assyrian Empire had been. And so the Persians had been over here, the Medes and the Persians, and they eventually came in and invaded. So now God's people are making a journey back to Jerusalem, which is right here. This is where most of the action of the northern and southern kingdom took place. Southern kingdom a little smaller here, northern kingdom right there. And this is where Paul did a lot of his travels. This would be Asia Minor. You can see towns like Ephesus that there's a letter written there. And then over here is where you get Corinth and you get Macedonia. You get Thessalonica and you get Berea and so forth over here. And then Rome would be over here off the map. Just a little point of reference. But this right here is kind of the seat of most of the story, where all that's happening. The main characters in this, as we mentioned and briefly, tell you a little bit more before we go through this, is King Ahasuerus. I'll get that right. Ahasuerus. Yeah. This was the Persian king who was in the royal line of Persian kings. He invaded Greece, but later was defeated by Greece, and later on he is assassinated by his own men in his court. Queen Vesti, she loses her position as queen because she disobeys her husband's orders, the king's order. Mordecai, he was raised and as a cousin to Esther. Esther would be younger than him. And you'll see in this story that he prevents the assassination of the Persian king, and God is going to use that in his providence. And so there's another man you're going to see introduced in the story. His name is Haman. He's the bad guy. He's one of the king's main advisors, and he's the one that's plotting to have an edict put in place to destroy all the Jews. So we're talking about the pivotal point that the Jewish people would be totally eradicated, wiped out, killed off, if it wasn't for Esther's heroic feat. And Haman, by the way, ends up hanging on the same gallows that he had built for Mordecai to hang on in a twist of ironic fate and so forth there. So let's start looking here at this. Chapter 1. Verse number 1 says, "And it came to pass in the days of Ahasuerus, I think is how we would do that, huh? That is Ahasuerus, which reigned from India even unto Ethiopia, and covered 127 provinces." That's actually not just cities, and not just like a county, but a large area. Countries, in a sense, a providence. So it's a large reign. So he has this feast in the third year, in verse 3. In the third year of his reign, he's going to make a feast, and he's going to invite all of his princes from these different providences in. He's going to invite the nobles, and they're going to come before him. And in verse number 4, and he shows them the riches of his kingdom. This glorious kingdom. You see that in verse 4? And the honor of his most excellent majesty. Many days, even 180 days. So this party goes on for a half a year, essentially. 180 days. Talk about a long party. And he is just showing him his power and how everybody loves him and the respect he gets and so forth. So in verse number 11, he brings his queen, his wife here, Vesti, in verse 11, to bring Vesti the queen before the king with the crown royal, and to show the people and the princes her beauty, for she was fair to look on. So this was his trophy wife. You hear that nowadays? The trophy wife. And he's going to bring her in, and he's going to make all these people happy. I got. Well, she apparently was one of the strong-willed women. Because in verse 12, but the queen refused, Vesti refused to come at the king's command. by his chamberlains. Wherefore was the king very wroth, angry, and his anger burned in him. He got ate up by it. This no one's going to, not even my wife will defile my orders. And so the queen, he has a decision to make. I mean, everybody's watching. Is the queen going to come or not? This is a big point of showing his power. Verse number 16. And Memucan answered before the king and the princes, Vesti the queen hath not done wrong to the king only, but also to all the princes and to all the people, and are in all the providences of the king. So basically, he gets his men to evaluate the situation, and the report comes back, not only king has she violated you, but she's disrespected all of us. She's lost her respect, of our respect for her. And in verse 17, and for this deed the queen shall come abroad unto all women, so that they shall despise their husbands and their eyes. When it shall be reported, the king as Ahasuerus commanded Vesti the queen to be brought in before him, but she came not. So they're telling the king, if you let her get away with this, guess what? My wife is going to want to do this to me. She's a role model for our women, and we can't let this go by. All of us men are in a vulnerable situation of losing our power. So you got to take care of her, king. So she's supposed to come, and she just doesn't show up. She's not coming in, is she? So in verse number 19, if it please the king, let there go a royal commandment from him, and let it be written among the laws of the Persians and the Medes, that it be not altered. That was an irrevocable law that when you did it that way. That Vesti come no more before King Ahasuerus, and let the king give her royal estate unto another that is better than she. In other words, she's out. You need to find a replacement. Put this in an irrevocable law that we're going to replace the queen. Well, we start chapter number 2. And this is the beginning, setting the stage for how Esther, just this Jewish virgin girl, is going to become the queen of a very vast kingdom. Now, she apparently knows what happened to Vesti. And you think that she's like excited about this? Is like, oh no, it's not easy walking in those shoes. So in verse number 1, after these things, when the wrath of King Ahasuerus was appeased, he remembered Vesti and what she had done, and was decreed against her. Then said the king's servants that ministered unto him, let there be fair young virgin sought for the king. All right, market for another wife. Let me log on to, or what's some of those other ones? Plenty of Fish. There's one a dating website called plentyoffish.com. I have a relative about 10 years ago. He was in the market for a new fling, and he went on Plenty of Fish. And so he meets up with this profile, and they agree to go out. And when he gets there, he finds out that she's like 15 years older than him. And I says, did you know that? He says, no, she had her age younger on the profile. I says, she lied? He goes, they all lie on there. I thought, oh, what a great way to start out a relationship. Why would you lie about that? That is something pretty easy to verify. That's not a problem if he wanted someone. I said, I was a little not nice. I said, did you go by the nursing home to pick her up for the date? He got, oh, you weren't that old. And at that time, he was probably 50. So, but anyhow. So in verse number 4, and let the maiden which pleaseth the king be queen instead of Vesti. And the thing pleased the king, and he did so. So this is what we're going to do. Verse 5, and now in Shushan, that is the full word for Susha, the abbreviated one there. Let me see, pick up my spot there. Now in, I got to get the right chapter. I'm just lost here. Now, verse number 5 of chapter 2. Now in Shushan, the palace, there was a certain Jew whose name was Mordecai. Now that's the cousin, Mordecai, the son of Jair, and the son of Shimea, and the son of Kish, a Benjaminite. Now bear that in mind. That's one of the 12 tribes. And what 2 tribes were in the southern kingdom? Judah, obviously, and there was one other tribe, Benjamin. Yeah, so let's see how that works out there. Verse 6, who had been carried away from Jerusalem with the captivity, which had been carried away with Jehoniah, the king of Judah, whom Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, had carried away. So they're setting up the story about how these people all got into captivity and where they're from and their origins and their ethnic background. And he brought up Hadassah, that is Esther. That was another name for Esther, probably more of a Jewish name. His uncle's daughter, for she had neither father or mother. Apparently they had died. And the maid was fair and beautiful, whom Mordecai, when her father and mother were dead, took for his own daughter. So essentially he raised a large part in raising Esther. So that's a close connection here. Verse number 10. Esther had not shown her people nor her kindred, for Mordecai had charged her that she should not show it. Show what? That she was a Jewish girl. Got to keep this secret. You have a chance to go before the king. He finds out you're Jewish, that's going to be a problem. So you don't tell people. It's a secret. It's covert. Verse 11, and Mordecai walked every day before the court of the woman's house to know how Esther did and what should become of her. So apparently all these maids were put in the same place. Maidens were put in the same place. And they were going to be brought before the king. They were probably being groomed. Kind of a school for queen. I don't know a degree in queenology. I don't know. And so he's walking by when he can to try to get some up-to-date information, how she's doing. But obviously he doesn't want to show there's a close connection between them. And so we're not going to be able to read all this, but it's a great story to read on your own when you get home. It's not a long read. I don't know, there's 10 chapters or so in the book. But we'll go down to verse 17. And the queen loved Esther above all the women. So we got to where they all are coming in, and the king goes, Esther's the one. She is a beaut. She's my next trophy wife. And she obtained grace and favor in his sight more than all the virgins, so that he set the royal crown upon her head and made her queen instead of Vesti. So here's this young girl that is thrown into this spot of being queen. A lot of vulnerability there. But God is setting in this providence, setting her up to be at the right place at the right time to show Himself mighty. In fact, look if you would at chapter 4 for a sneak ahead in verse number 14. There's a phrase in this verse that you'll sometimes read in Christian literature. 4:14. If thou altogether, now this is Mordecai telling Esther, you need to go in and deal with this issue with the king. Now remember, just because she was queen didn't mean she had full access to him. She only should come when she's called. Now she does take the risk if she goes in and he lifts his scepter, that means that it's okay, come on in. But also it could result in her dying for going to the king without permission, without being called. And obviously she's intimidated by all that. And so here's what her cousin Mordecai tells her in verse 14. For if thou altogether holdest thy peace at this time, then shall there enlargement and deliverance arise to the Jews from another place. But thou and thy father's house shall be destroyed. And who knoweth whether thou art come to this kingdom? Esther, who knows whether God has put you right in this spot for such a time as this? And that phrase has been used a lot in Christianity, that God's timing is impeccable. And why are we here now today in this place? For such a time as this. There are no mistakes. His providence is mighty, isn't it? For such a time as this. So back in chapter 2, the royal crown is now upon her head. And we move to verse number 20. Esther had not yet shown her kindred nor her people as Mordecai had charged her. So here is a teachable young lady that's taking the spiritual insight from her cousin as such. For Esther did the command of Mordecai as when she was brought up with him. In verse 21, and in those days, while Mordecai sat in the king's gate, two of the king's chamberlains, Bigthan and Tirash, of those which kept the door, were wroth. They were angry and sought to lay hand on the king. So here's Mordecai, just happens to be there, and these two chamberlains of the king are all angry about something. They're saying, we're going to kill the king. We got a plot to kill the king. He needs to be taken out of here. Verse 22, and the thing which was known to Mordecai, who told it unto Esther the queen, and Esther certified the king thereof in Mordecai's name. In other words, put him on the roster. Verse 23, and when inquisition was made of the matter, it was found out, therefore they both were hung on a tree, and it was written in the book of the Chronicles before the king. So Mordecai tells Esther, Esther gets this information to the king, there's a plot, a conspiracy, they take it to court, these men are found guilty, and they're hung. So basically, he saved the king's life. Noble thing. So this is all going to play into a role here. Verse number 1 of chapter 3. So after these things, watch the time, and after these things did King Ahasuerus promoted Haman. Now this is the bad guy, the villain in this plot. Promoted Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agatite, and advanced him and set his seat above all the princes around him. So this man, Haman, is earned the trust of the king. He's going to be a big player in the king's government. In fact, he's second, like a vice president in a sense, or above all the others. And he's going to play into that. And we're going to leave it right there so we don't get too far into it. We can't find a good break point. So you can see that providence of God is a wonderful thing. And just a closing comment here. We live in a day when a lot of people try to promote an ongoing scenario of signs and miracles. Come get your sign and miracle. See this outstanding, marvelous thing. And we know that that's not always been the case of how God wants it. And sometimes people only get excited when they see something that looks like a big thing that God has done or a miraculous thing. But knowing the providence of God and how meticulous it is can get us excited too, to know that today He's doing some things for our tomorrows. And when we look back, we're going to go, wow, I see how this worked out now. I see how I ended up where I am because God was working this now. You say, well, I haven't ended up in a very good spot right now. Well, maybe God was working that out because in the past, He either wanted to take you to a tough spot to test you or use you or to correct you, to take you through that. But remember, God doesn't have to wait to see what decisions we're going to make. God doesn't have to wait to see how things turn out. He has foreknowledge. That doesn't mean we don't have free will, but He knows how we're going to exercise that free will. So things that we think today that we've done, that we've gotten away with, God is in His providence working those things to either correct that in our life, use that thing to bring Him honor, or whatnot. And so we can have great confidence to know that nothing is out of control. Do you think COVID-19 caught God by surprise and the reaction to it and all? Nothing. It's exciting times because we're living through it. And it may get nasty like the end of the book says in our time while we're here. Then God may take us out before all that real bad stuff starts. But in any event, At the very end of the book we read it, those last few chapters of Revelation, and we win. God wins, we win. And it's just that we don't always keep that in our sight, do we? We think, oh man, we're losing ground. Only right now. There may be a battle we may lose, but we'll win the war. Let's finish in prayer. Father, thank you today for your good blessings in our life all the time. Father, you have done much to help us and bless us and give us along the way what we needed. And sometimes what we needed was not having what we wanted and having a hard thing. But that was okay because that grows us and matures us. So we need to thank you for all things, including those things. Father, bless our morning service. May you be honored by it always.